Hey you guys, welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to be doing another real-time portrait sketching walkthrough, but this time instead of having the audio done after, I want to do the audio live just like I do on Patreon. For today we're just going to be using technically one pencil, but I do just want to use this one up, so I'm going to use this first one for the first parts of the sketch, but after a while I'll be switching back to the longer one. So I'm going to start off with a circle again. This is the sphere that's just the top of the skull, so I'm going to be adding this flat part of the side right there. Usually you don't see it, especially when we're drawing portraits from up front. This is just off to the side, so we don't normally need to draw this. This cross just really tells me that this is a flat plane and reminds me when I do the shading later. What we're gonna do now is draw a line that goes down the center of her face. But because she is looking all the way off to the side, this is where the center of her face will be. Just try to think of the angle that her nose is going in the photo. I think it gives a good idea of where this line would fall. And then this first circle we're going to cut in half, and that will be the eye line. Because you're sort of looking down, this line is just going to swoop down like that. And so you can see that these sides aren't fully equal because of that. But what we're going to do is just make her face roughly about the same size as this last one. So from here going down here, we're just going to mark out where her chin is gonna end. And so now that we have that, we're just gonna take this line right here and then connect it to this part of her jaw, which should start right here from the center of that cross. And that would be our jawline. So her ear is gonna start right here from the center of this cross also. Just gonna roughly draw that in there, give it its own space. And now what we're gonna do is just roughly make out where her neck is gonna be. I think it's a good idea to figure out how much space we can see from the start of her chin to where the neck is. So I think this is roughly where it should be. And then for this photo, you can see that her neck is covered by her hair, but I think it would roughly fall around here, right behind where the ear is. Then we're just gonna draw out where the shoulders are. And this would be her chest. I'm gonna draw the strap of her shirt like that, just so I can see. And our back is gonna go in like this. What I'm now gonna do is zoom you guys in so we can see and start to draw her head. So what I want to do is just make sure that I'm following what I see on the photo when it comes to her profile. So just roughly draw out her forehead like this. And it sort of goes in to where her chin is. We're going to disregard every line and contour of her nose and her mouth first. We're just going to make sure that her forehead is going in the same angle that it should, where it should be pointing towards the chin. So around like that, I would say, is good. And now what we're gonna do is, since that was the line for her eyebrows, draw another line. I think I called this the eye line before, but that was for the eyebrows, and I always forget to say that. So just gonna draw this other line for where we want the actual eyes to sit. So this is gonna be where it goes, and then right here where the center line is, we're just gonna roughly draw out a nose. And you can see it would be, usually it goes around where this part ends or where the circle ends. Try not to worry about the shape of the nose and following the reference photo at this point. Just want to make sure it has its own place in the face. And then once that's in there, what we're going to do is divide this area in half. And that would be where we want our mouth to be. And then we're just going to make sure that I have enough space for the chin. Do the same thing for the upper lip. We're just gonna leave that mouth for now. What we're gonna do is draw out the actual eyeballs now. Since we're kind of looking at her from the side, we can actually see her eye almost go out of her face, but that's not abnormal. It's just how the angle of the head is. And we're gonna draw the other eyeball, which you can see it is much larger than the one before, or just that we can see more of it than the other one because of how the angle sits. And make sure that this one is more off to the side too. And now I'm just gonna roughly draw out the angle, her eyebrows. It's very arched up, this one. This arch just conveniently stops where this flat part of her face is. And then what we're gonna do now is take that eye and see where the mouth line stops in reference to it. So I think it stops right around here. Just gonna have her mouth like that. So you just want to make sure that it has the space that it needs on the face. Just gonna draw in her hairline. And again, this is different for different people. What I'm looking at now is how her hair falls in the reference photo. So she has this center part and it just swoops down to her ear right here. What we're gonna do when we draw that center part is still follow this line that goes down the center of her face. And then we're just gonna give her hair a little bit more volume than her head. And this one should go right here. Keep note of where that center part is. And I'm just gonna roughly finish it off. And on this side, do the same thing too. Now that we're moving on to the details, I'm switching to a sharper pencil. The great thing about having these eyeballs first is that we can kind of just imagine how the eyelids are just falling over that shape. Because we're looking at it almost straight up from the side, that would be what the shape looks like from the side. And just gonna draw out her iris right there. And then the fold of her upper eyelid should still follow that eyeball that's underneath. And doing the same thing with her eye bags too. So it's kind of convenient to have that eyeball drawn in first. I'm going to do the same thing to this other one. And again, because we're looking at her from the side, instead of the eyelids drooping down from the center, it will be falling on the eyeball like that. Almost just one angle. Then just roughly finish off that sphere that's inside before we go in with the lower lid. Which again, the angle is much different from how the eye would look if we were drawing her head on. Just drawing out the iris really. And again, when we're drawing that fold of her eyelid, we're still following that eyeball inside, and do the same thing for the lower one. So now we're going to move on to her nose, and I think her nose is very interesting because I really like its shape. So what we're going to do is just make sure that we're following the shape of it from the reference photo. So it's sort of a little bit more straight right here and goes down like that before it goes back out right at the center of her nose, right at the very tip. And just be going in like that. I'm just gonna erase this part so there's more of this rounded shape right here at the tip of her nose, and then it's gonna go back in before it flares out into the nostrils. It also just stops. This actually, her eye should be a bit closer right there because her nose just stops right before her eyes start. And I'm just gonna draw out her nostril underneath too. And then what I'm gonna do is move on to her lips first. So she sort of has this very defined groove under her nose. I don't know what it's called, but it also goes down to her cupid's bow, so it's very defined like that. We're just gonna draw it curved in before it follows the line of her mouth. And then we're gonna do the same thing for her lower lip. It's gonna, except this time it's gonna start further in than the upper one. Then we're just making sure it's, the rounded part is right at the center of her face before it goes into the corner of her lips. And we're gonna do the same thing here. And make sure that we're following the reference photo where it's fullest right at the center. And then now I think you can move on to her eyebrows. Just wanna fill them in really. Make sure that I'm following where the hair grows. Actually, I need to make this one. I actually need to move this one further up, but not great at drawing eyebrows. Just making sure I'm following and I'm getting it to be right around the same shape as the reference photo. I think now what we need to do is just making sure we're following the contours of her face right. And so before I do that, what I'm going to do is take my kneaded eraser again, just lightly tap in on the darkest areas, just so that when we add in these more final details, they would show up on the page. So now we're just going to look at the reference photo, making sure that the contours of her profile looks similar. So her forehead sort of is more rounded out, and her brow bone just goes in to her eye like that. But for her cheek right here, sort of see more of it than what we did in the drawing. So her nose, I think, should actually be lower down. And so we're just gonna lightly correct it. And then we're just gonna see just a little bit of her cheek right there. What I think is really interesting is how her chin, it sort of starts almost right at the center of her lip right there. And what we're gonna do is draw the rest of it down before we connect her chin to the line of her jaw right here. And now what we're gonna do is finish off the rest. So start from her neck. She has her throat is more hollow. So just gonna divide it right here before it goes in behind her shoulder. This would be where her shoulders rounded. With her chest just slightly peeking out. And then her hair, just gonna roughly make sure that it's following the contours of her back and her neck. And over here, just follow what we see on the photo. While we're here for her hair too, you might want to go in with the direction that they're flowing. So it's always best to group them, I think, and make sure that you're taking note of where the hair is growing from, especially right here in the center part. It's not all gonna look like they're coming from one direction. Sort of just goes in the center before it goes out. And these groups right here would go back in behind her ear. And her ear I'm just gonna roughly draw out too. Really not great at explaining the ears. Just roughly following what I see. I'm actually just gonna make this one a little bit bigger. What's left now is to do the shading and the extra details. This is optional, but because I'm using one pencil, what I want to do is just roughly take out some of the darker lines again, so that this same pencil can make darker layers, darker details on top. What we're gonna do now is take the pencil on its side, and the first thing to do is just really roughly start from where you think the darkest areas are, just because it's easier, and also you can get your pencil more accustomed to the movement that it makes when it's shading. On her left eye, just gonna do the same thing and mostly just shade in her upper eyelid and move it onto the lower one. But after we have that, we're just gonna extend the hollow of her eyelid right there, going all the way down to the bridge of her nose. And right here, I'm just gonna really roughly shade right on top of her nose and down to her nostril. Again, just make sure you're keeping your strokes very light at this point. Right, just gonna follow the rest of the nostril and do the same thing to her cheek that's on the other side. When we start shading in her lips, what we're gonna do first is do it all in one go. And then again, that's just the first layer. So it always also helps to mark out where you think the shaded areas are. Especially right here, we can see that it goes down to her cheek from her eyes. And then shade it in like you did before. And then right here below her mouth and the side of her lips, just gonna mark it out. And make sure make sure you're being very light with these shadings at first. And right here, just follow where her cheekbone is. I'm gonna shade it from the darkest area up to the lightest. And then slowly extend it to the rest of her jaw. Make sure you're going lighter as you're doing this. And then we're gonna start again from the bottom of her jaw, where it's the darkest, and it will go lighter as it reaches almost right to the cheekbone, but not completely touching it. And then we're gonna extend that same shading down to the hollow of her throat. Make sure we're not shading this area. And we're just gonna shade out where we see that there's shadow in the photo. I'm also using different directions to make the shading look more three-dimensional too, with just the direction. I'm not being very great at it. It's very rough right now, but yeah, that's what I'm doing. And now we're just gonna really lightly shade in her forehead. Be very careful. Just want to make sure still it doesn't look that way, but there are planes to the forehead and it's sort of flat right at the center, so it's just gonna be shading it like this. And this flat side of her face too, from the circle that we talked about, is gonna be shaded in as well. Make sure that this right here connects to that area. And then that would be it for the first layer of shading on her face. What we're gonna do now is take our same pencil and shade in the entirety of her hair in one go. Make sure that your pencil is still on its side and you're also following the direction that the hairs are waving to. It's not always very visible, but it still helps. It really helps for later when we're adding some of those hair strands on top. see this right here. Try not to worry about how it looks right now. What we're really making sure of is that there is this one value that makes the hair darker than her skin. This is far from what it would look when it's done. And see, this is very, you can see this is very rough. Just want to have this whole thing completely filled out for the darker layers after. And what I'm gonna do now is draw in the darker details to the face. We're gonna add more dimension to the shading after, actually. Usually I would do the opposite, but I just wanna make sure that I don't lose these details before I go in with that. I'm gonna draw her pupil like that. See it mostly from the side. And then these would be her lower lashes. And then before I move on to the upper ones where they're longer. I'm just not great at drawing lashes. It's so frustrating. Yeah, but when we move on to the other one, make sure you're marking out her pupil too. Really say it goes further out because that's where her eye is sitting. And that's how it looks from the angle that we're looking at it from. I'm also gonna make her eyebrows darker too. Just mark out the hair strands more than what I first draw them as. This is just so arched the way I drew it, but then we're gonna do is darken her nostril like this. And also shade more of her lips starting from the center and then flare that shading out. Also gonna make her mouth line darker. Then I'm just drawing out the outline so I don't lose it from the dark background of her hair. And do the same thing to her chin. What I'm gonna do is mark out these darker lines and then maybe shade them out just lightly, just so there's more dimension to within our shading. Her nose is also pointier than in the reference photo. Erase that completely and then draw it back in. Be easier. And so we're gonna do the same thing to her ears. Just start from the shading from the darkest part. So right here, and then roughly darken out those outlines. And what I'm doing right now is drawing on top of the rough shading on her hair so that I bring back the structure of those groups of hair and it looks more realistic to how they should fall. How I shaded it in at first really made them look like they're just one chunk of hair on her head, and I don't want that. So maybe just add in some outer hair strands that are falling. By the way, I forgot to say that the reference photo is from Graphite Studio. Heard about them when I watched one of Chris Hong's videos And now I follow them on Instagram. Just making sure that we're adding these hair strands that are darker right here, so there's separation between her neck and where those hair strands are. And do the same thing for the rest. Make sure it's darkest right before it reaches her profile, so it really shapes her out. And now the final thing to do is make sure that the values on this side of her head catches up to the values on these hair strands on the other side. We don't want to make all of it super dark. Just at the darkest parts catch up to the values on the other side. Some baby hairs right there. Just making sure you're following again where the hair strand should go. It helps to continually look at the reference photo while you're doing this. I'm gonna make these hair strands not as dark as these ones right here. I'm just gonna make this part right here darker to flesh out her ear more. Also making sure that I'm emphasizing this groove right here, making her upper lip fuller, especially right at the center, but it's very full right there. And we're gonna make this area more in highlight. And then I will be done with the sketch. I'm just gonna make her eyes look darker and shape it out more, and then I will be done with the sketch. So yeah, that is it for this one. This is what it looks like. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Tell me if you like this format, and I will be doing more of it if you do. And if you're interested in more of these kinds of videos, I do them on my Patreon. But that is it for this one, and I will be seeing you guys again soon.